But I had some things in my past that left me feeling a little unsatisfied unless I was achieving. And
so it came from somewhere.
Yeah.
It wasn't just that you were so driven by your curiosity.
No.
There was also a thorn in the side.
No, I was trying to kind of prove to myself that I had value, that I could make it in the world. And sometimes that feeling that the only possible way to do that would be to overachieve.
Welcome to The Enlightened Overachiever, where we explore what it means to be a person living in a time of extraordinary change and intensity. I'm Lauren Shorter, coach, author, thinker, and guide for people at moments of complexity and change, which I think sums up where we are today. Let's get started. When I first started taking commercial airlines a lot in my 20s, when I had a real job and I was traveling around the world for work, suddenly I was flying quite often for work. And once I'd overcome the sweaty palms, what I spent most of my time doing was looking out the window, because down on the ground, I saw something I'd never seen before, the earth from above, and the patterns underneath the surface. I started to realize how much of life has layered on top of life. And I think this is what brought me and Richard Watkins into connection, because we happen to be dads in the same village and we both have kids. Within a few minutes with Richard, I was talking about Wittgenstein. I don't know how that happened. Now, Richard is not a philosopher. He's an accomplished leadership practitioner and consultant. He's built a great business around helping teams to transform in a healthy way. And I enjoyed the conversation a lot. You'll see, I think, how it connects quite clearly with the themes of the Enlightened Overachiever, which is really about developing that capacity to question the way that we think so that we can continually become more adept and skillful at expanding beyond our own constraints. Welcome to Richard. Thank you for joining me, Rich. So, Rich, in some ways, you are mainly a person I met in the village where I live. We live in the same village, Forest Row in East Sussex in England. And we're both dads of children of similar age, and we got talking and we do similar work. We both work in the field of leadership and organizational development and coaching. And I was interested in how you think. And I think the moment that we started talking about stuff that wasn't kids, I noticed that you think in an unusual way, and specifically how you think about thinking, which seems to have been a big part of your inquiry. And you've done a lot of deep research into that and your own life and your own study, and you've blended it together in a very simple way into a framework for teams and businesses. That's part of what you do, is that you've synthesized all this stuff into a useful thing, right? An artifact that's useful and that you use, and that's your business. It's centered around that. And you come from an innovation background, working for What If, which is an agency that was quite pioneering in the 10, 20 years ago in bringing innovation and design thinking into the business space as a consultancy. And you're clearly someone who's really interested in innovation and thinking and collaboration and leadership. But I'm not so focused on, in this conversation, I'm not so focused or interested in the framework that you've created for teams and businesses. It's of interest, but it's not the main focus for me. I'm interested primarily in where you've got to in your thinking about thinking and your living about thinking, or the living that's arisen from that. Mainly because that's the invisible stuff that we all live and live around in. It's a big part of my inquiry in this podcast, in The Enlightened Overachiever. So I would like to suggest that there's two bits of this for me in my conversation with you. The first bit would be, you have some kind of rock influences, right? So if you're a musician, you've got your influences, and those are the thinkers who have influenced your thinking about thinking. And you listed some of those to me when we chatted. And I think that's a really important part of it's a big part of your YouTube channel for a start. And it's a part of your public persona, insofar as you're thinking out loud, not just with clients and businesses, but on social media. And you're very honest and open and giving about crediting your influences. So they're a big part of your online persona set, whether it's Heidegger or Wittgenstein or Donna Haraway. So I would love to hear about the thinkers who think about thinking, who've influenced your thinking. And then I would also like to hear where you've got to in terms of your own thinking about thinking. That feels just so in a way, you're like I say, you're great at crediting, and I'm sort of interested in what's become distinctively yours, or what is emerging that feels like the kernel of something that you've always known and have been rediscovering. Now, those don't have to happen immediately, but in terms of the conversation itself, those would be the pillars in a way. To start with, let's hear a little bit about you and your journey and how you came to be who you are and doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a lot to roam around. Yeah. So my name's Rich Watkins, and I don't even know where to begin, really. Maybe I'll just say a kind of a pen portrait of the journey that I've gone on. So I grew up in Essex, in a rural village in Essex near Malden, which is where the salt comes from. And then at 16, I was exploring where to go I was at a comprehensive school, and I was exploring where to go next. And there was a grammar school that my brother had been to that I could have gone to for my A-levels. But my dad brought home an opportunity to work. He worked at BP, the oil company, and there was an apprenticeship, and something about it captivated me as an idea. It involved me moving to the other side of London as a 16-year-old and taking on study part-time while working. And I remember going to visit without a strong idea that it would be what I would do, and just feeling very, very intoxicated with the idea of being paid money, living on my own, and learning and studying for myself. So I took an apprenticeship. There weren't many apprenticeships. They'd revived an old apprenticeship program, and they only revived it for about 2 or 3 years, and then I think it died again. But I did that, and that took me into sort of a world of chemistry, and I was doing all of that for a while, and that was very influential. I spent a lot of time just trying to avoid looking like a work experience kid, because at 16, some 16-year-olds I see now, they're very burly. I was not a burly 16-year-old. I looked like I was about 10 and a half. And I was like living on my own and trying to figure that all out. And then moved to another part of BP, to Castrol, at a technology center near Reading, and then was very disillusioned and managed to find myself at this company, What If, who you'd mentioned, quite a pioneering kind of innovation consultancy, kind of came to run some workshops, and I just became very intoxicated with the idea of what this job was, innovation consulting, and found it very amazing and alluring, and contacted them. And it took me about 6 months to persuade them to give me a job. For them, they were really only recruiting people with a lot of experience, but I'd had 8 years experience at this point. But obviously I was also 24, so they were kind of puzzled as to where to put me. And so then I went there, and that was like a seismic shift in my whole world. I was like a development technologist looking at the sort of engine deposits in marine engines, and then suddenly was doing marketing and innovation and design thinking and ethnographic research. And that like opened up my whole world. And I was there for about 8 years, another 8 years. So 8 years, or 7.5. And that took me all around the world. And I lived in China, I lived in South Korea. I burnt a hideous amount of carbon in aeroplanes, taking me to Brazil and Australia and all these sort of places where I was running projects, and then started as quite a wide-eyed kind of thing, and then, grew into a slightly grizzled consultant working with senior leaders, and then kind of threw myself into independent life where I was a consultant. And then it took me a few years before I even realized why I'd done that. I think I knew that I had to leave, but I didn't know what I was leaving for. And then, I was doing a lot of collaborative art projects and started to pay more attention to kind of some aspects of more like leadership and personal development. And then kind of it was 2016 that I kind of found this framework, the Let's Go model. And then I recruited some people and built a team. And then I've been working with that for the last 9 years. So I don't know if that's, I guess, kind of more of a work lens on my journey, all that, but that's sort of where I come from and where I'm coming from. What's interesting is you talk about thinking a lot, and obviously like I'm not academic, or I'm not trained academically. And so it's quite interesting. Like I've read I consider myself sort of quite a pop reader. I've not done a lot of higher education. I did a degree in chemistry part-time and did quite well at that. And then I've done some study breaks. I did a study break to UC Berkeley in California in 2009. And then I've done some night school stuff at Goldsmiths. But really, it's interesting because I don't feel very academic, and yet I'm a thinker. So it's quite, I think there's something about me that is very grounded in action and grounded in doing rather than thinking, but then very interested in thinking. So that's quite a long answer to your first question, I think, but maybe that gives a bit of a picture of where I'm coming from and how I kind of, does that give you enough to get going with?
Yeah. So you're part-time, I was going to ask about the university piece. So you never went to uni in the way that a lot of kids do. You just worked. Yeah. And as part of that, you did a part-time, was it an MA? What was it?
BSc. So I was at the University of Greenwich studying chemistry. I was sort of working 4 days a week, and then I used to wake up at I think I used to get the train at 6:30 a.m. and get back about 7:30 p.m. and do like an 8-hour day of lectures, and they crammed it all in, and then would occasionally do sort of a week where I would do a week of intensive laboratory work in the university, but it was just, and then working 4 days a week. So that's my world of study, really.
I'm struck by the word intoxicating that you used a couple of times. It sounds like a very nice compass for taking action.
Yeah. I think that's sort of how it's often felt. Like sometimes I've taken some quite courageous steps, or steps that seem courageous. Like I took on 3 employees from a standing start when I found the Let's Go framework and wanted to kind of work with that. And people would say like, oh, that's very courageous. And I would just say like, I couldn't do anything else at that point. Like,
meaning
I couldn't not do it. I couldn't not throw myself into this next thing. And so when I don't have that sense of compulsion, I don't take very strong actions. I just kind of drift around, and I do a lot of thinking about whether this is right or that's right or this, and I sort of mulch around. And then occasionally I get these moments of great clarity, and it's almost like a physical compulsion, or I use the word intoxication. I think I would connect to thinkers that have influenced me. Rob Barbea is a meditation teacher, and he talks about eros and the erotic drive. And I really feel, and he doesn't just mean sort of sexual drive, he means kind of that full body sense that this is what I want, and the moving towards what you want in a certain kind of way. And I think that's my life has been a series of infatuations, if you like, but those infatuations being quite deep and lasting.
What's the longest period you've gone without an infatuation to organize your life around?
I'm taken back to being in Reading, working for Castrol, and feeling very lost and empty and very uninfatuated. And there's probably a period when I was about to leave What If, but I hadn't become clear how. And that was probably another year of feeling like I wanted to leave, but not having the drive or the impetus to leave. And I think in those kind of times, that stagnant feeling I feel it very strongly. So when it comes, I find it very difficult to feel anything but the stagnation. And then probably a time when I was maybe living at home, feeling like, really, am I heading into more schooling and more a new school? And that also felt kind of stagnant. And I think that's one of the reasons why the kind of opportunity to move felt so compulsive, because I was sort of feeling stagnant. So I think maybe that polarity between stagnation and drive is like an interesting one that I've felt. And when I start feeling that, I don't find it comfortable, and I get very distressed by it. And then I just think, okay. And then when something arrives, it's like a great relief. Even if it requires bold action, it feels very easy to do.
There's a lot of the discomfort in the waiting for something to show up that's compelling you, or is it just a sort of denial or resistance of the stagnation? I shouldn't be feeling like this, and so on, or both?
I don't know. I've not thought about it. I think it's just a restlessness. I just feel restless. I feel like, this isn't the place for me. So there's a sort of sense of not rightness or not correctness. It's like, this isn't what I'm for. This is not my thing. And then the finding of something is,
So just to go back to your thinking well, you've told me a story which I cottoned on to about that time in Berkeley, UC Berkeley in California. And I imagine that there was an element of compulsion and intoxication there too. What led you to be doing that, and what was it like?
Why did I go to Berkeley? And
well, not just that, but tell us a little bit about the intoxication there, and also what then occurred as a result. What was the transformation? Because I had a feeling it was transformative.
Yeah, it definitely was. I mean, I think I felt this sort of I felt a longing for some sort of something study. Like I'd never gone to uni, right? So this version was 8 weeks in one of the best unis in the world, taking a couple of classes, one in rhetoric and one in art. So an art class on visual thinking, like how do you think in art, and one on the rhetoric, which was really like the foundations of the philosophy of language. And I think those two things together, also with the freedom of being a student, which I'd never had, those two things. And then also at that time, I kind of fell in love with poetry in a new way. So I think there was a lot of things that kind of were very transformative about that 8 weeks. It was like a portal into something. And I would say some of the ideas in that rhetoric class have then echoed through my life about, I don't think I'd ever thought about what language is really. And I guess Ludwig Wittgenstein came into my life at that point as a philosopher who, again, I think I'd associated philosophy with a lot of high-level abstractions. And Ludwig Wittgenstein kind of calls us back to simple examples and everyday language. And the plainness of how we speak can be profound rather than like profane is a kind of, I think, a part of where he's coming from in his later work. So, yeah, I don't know if that kind of goes anywhere, but...
Yeah, I think the sense I got was that you had tapped into a vein of thinking and philosophy, and it uncovered a whole world of examination of mind, I think, not in a spiritual way, but in a semantic or semiotic way that was really profound. And it felt like there was a real thread of integrity between that and what you're doing today. And what I noticed, and I think what caught my attention, is that many people, myself included, live in a fairly fuzzy thought world. So when we think about thinking or language or meaning, we've done a lot of improvising, you've done a lot of trial and error. You've got the stuff that you picked up from your environments and your conditioned background, and then you've got your own stuff you've figured out. But it's rare for people to have apart from philosophers, right, to have a very structured and clean, like tidy room, a tidy mental room. And I'm not saying you've got a tidy mental room, but you've got at least you're looking at the untidiness from the doorway or from outside the window from time to time. So I'm really curious about that. And but let's just come back to that in a moment, because I want to finish introducing Rich a bit, right? Introducing you. I'm interested to know, as it all comes together into the now, you created the Let's Go framework, which is part of your online identity and part of your business. What's compelling you now?
So 9 years into working with that, I think the thing that compels me now is how it lives beyond me. So I think it kind of was born, but what I'm most energized by now is how it lives at scale and through other people. So I have about 40 facilitators who have trained in the approach. And then I'm also doing a bunch of the work I do with clients is to take that out to the world. I think that still excites me and energizes me. And I can feel like a moment of opening up something else too. And I don't know exactly what that is. So that's very like in the nascent phase, or in the phase where I don't have a clear sense of like, oh, it's this, or it's this, or it's this. So I definitely feel like the Let's Go thing is still moving and still motivating me. And that I feel very grateful for. I really feel like I found something that can be a life's work, like, because people have to work with people. And how do we work with people well? That basically is the question of Let's Go. And I talk about collaboration, but what I mean is people and working well with people. How does that go? And I feel like that can go to a lot of places, and I'm very energized by where that can go and how the stuff that I've done can live in culture in a wider way. So that's still motivating. And I do feel like some of the ideas that I play with around philosophy or around how to live well in a complex world are there's still something else. And I don't know what that is, and I don't know where that goes. But I'm kind of enjoying what's nice is that to have something that you're motivated by and then to be playing with other stuff around it feels like a nicer way to do it than to be in the void where you don't feel like you have anything that orientates your life. And I think I felt like that for a decent amount of time. And I feel forever grateful that at the moment that's not alive for me. Now, that might be alive for me again at some point, right? Through disillusionment or through change or those things. But yeah, I don't have that kind of void.
I think it would be important before the end of this conversation to come back to the Let's Go model. I do feel that it's important, given that it is still part of your life's work, and to join the dots between that and what you see in the world and all the thinking stuff. And just sidestepping into, this is the enlightened overachiever, into the idea of overachieving. And in your own life, it does seem that you're, to an unusual extent or to a notable extent, you're an achiever, right? So you're into action, you've done a lot of things, and you went straight into work, and it doesn't sound like you've paused to take breath that much. You haven't been in the desert of self-reflection or wandering around in crisis or burnout. Similarly, you haven't been stagnating. Oh, you have?
Yeah, I have. After leaving What If, definitely. Yeah.
You were? Okay. Well, that's interesting, and I'd like to explore it, because in my understanding of the journey of an overachiever, if there's such a thing as a journey of an overachiever, it starts with a largely unquestioned drive to achieve and some kind of internal learned reward system around scoring points or getting strokes for doing well or doing stuff. And then at some point it unravels, and the motivations that were coded and that worked for a while unravel, and then follows a kind of lostness or an alchemical kind of mulchy Negrido phase where we don't really know what's going to happen, dark night of the soul thing. And then the overachiever rediscovers themselves as a sort of a part of something bigger or something more interdependent, or finds a deeper sort of purpose. It's the domain of soul, really, rather than spirit, which I know is a distinction you're interested in.
Yeah.
So I'd like to hear a little bit about that in your own lived experience, and or anyone else who you've walked alongside who's been through that, clients or friends, and what you've noticed about that pattern, that archetypal journey of the overachiever to something different.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'll just say something on overachievement. I think that, my life, I was a 16-year-old in a large multinational, and then I was the youngest ever, what they were called inventor, which is like an innovation consultant, or What If. So I think overachievement by those measures would be an appropriate word. And I would have, I think I once got called the golden boy in sort of slightly disparaging terms. But yeah, so that's, I would always just say that overachievement is always domain specific. And the overachievement that I achieved in some domains, you could also map an underachievement in other domains, right? Like if you look at my, relational life, or my different parts of my life were underachieving whilst overachieving at work. So I think I was very a work overachiever rather than an overachiever, full stop, capital letters. So I think that's true.
Are there any overachievers?
No, right.
I think capital letters.
I think that's sort of my point, right? So I think, and in the celebration of these domains, like of work, which are, some domains that matter. Yeah, I think it's sort of masking other things. And I definitely found that, I threw myself into my work to an extent that sort of was exhausting and overwhelming. And, I spent years and years almost hardly able to take a breath. And
not seeing friends, not building relationships, not taking exercise. What were the things that you were underachieving in?
Yeah, I think kind of, I found myself busy outside of work as well, doing art things. But I was very immersed, I think, in my own world and the world of my own creating. And I think some of the warmth and depth that you get from just softening into relationships and building kind of life with people, I think I would always be called intense, would be a word that followed me around a lot. He's very intense. And I think that focus on whatever I'm focused on to the exclusion of other things means there's a lot of not noticing that happens, a lot of not noticing things that are outside of focus. And then I did have that experience, right, where I was burnt out. By the end of my time doing the consulting, the innovation consulting, I was burnt out and very disillusioned. Innovation sounds very exciting, all new things, but actually what was I often doing? Like, a new beer or like a new credit card aimed at this particular demographic. It's like, is that what I'm for? So I think when I left, I had a strong sense that I'd drunk some Kool-Aid around what I was and who I was and what it meant to be part of this very trendy, like best place to work agency that had a big kind of aura around it. And I think, when I left, I had to contend with being just me and being an independent consultant who didn't have that aura and didn't have that energy around myself. And then I had to live with scraping by and trying to make sense of what it was that I cared about and realizing that it really wasn't innovation at all. Like I didn't have a strong investment in new technology or new ways, like really newness. But I did then eventually found my way to saying, no, what I really love is people working together to get stuff done. And, I talked about art projects that I'd run. And again, like I have a particular way of procrastinating. And my particular way of procrastinating is to create something that looks and feels impressive. So write a poetry book or create a art project with 50 artists in 6 cities who are all collaborating together to work. These are the kind of things that I do to avoid.
You procrastinate by achieving things.
Yeah, exactly. So it's also a kind of this overachievement is like, yes, it's over as in too much, as in an overemphasis, as in an obsessive attentiveness towards achievement when achievement isn't necessarily the thing that is most needed. So I feel like, I think it was, what's his name? The School of Life guy.
Alain de Botton
in his book, Status Anxiety, who talks about how we should pity the overachiever because what desperate unhappiness in their life has driven them to so compulsively go after something. And I think
what desperate unhappiness was driving you.
There we go, Lawrence. And some of that I'll just leave with me and my therapist. But what I will say is I had some I have some things in my past that I won't probably go into right now, but I had some things in my past that left me feeling a little unsatisfied unless I was achieving. And
so it came from somewhere.
Yeah.
It wasn't just that you were so driven by your curiosity.
No.
There was also a thorn in the side.
No, I was trying to kind of prove to myself that I had value, that I could make it in the world. And sometimes that feeling that the only possible way to do that would be to overachieve. So
take me back to the moment then, or the period after you quit that job and you said you're in sort of procrastination, but also soul searching.
Yeah.
What was going on for you emotionally at that time, and how was it? Give us a feeling for that.
I think it was a real sense. I think I had to come to terms with the fact that a lot of my strength came from outside of myself and the structures that I lived inside of. So the rewarding sense of, again, I think most obviously, the job that I had was the thing that was holding me up. And when the job wasn't there, I felt very unheld and I felt very unsteady. And so then my ability to persuade clients that I was someone worth, trusting the future of your organization with was not great. And actually, this is when I came across the Strozzi Institute, which is an institute of embodied leadership. And that was really realizing the connection that I needed to make back to myself as body, not mind. Myself as like, and again, I think my thinking about thinking is actually influenced by the body and the body's role in thinking. And in a way, I might not even use the word thinking. I might use the word sensing, like the sensing of what a body feels. Like a body in the world sees certain things and cares about certain things and doesn't care about other things. And if you just abstract that to thought, you lose a real depth and quality to what humans, I guess, to go to Heidegger, humans are orientated by what we care about. We are alive, not that we're following patterns of how one should act or what one should do, but we're connected to a motivating sense that we as a being in this world care about some things and don't care about other things. And it's the caring that precedes action. And so that, in a way, realizing, so we talked about eros and this drive, like that's noticing of what you are actually driven by, what you actually care about, rather than what is impressive or what is respected or what is likely to be rewarded by the world. Like all of those external measures aren't the proper way to orientate yourself in a messy, complex world. And I'd done a lot of orientating myself by the outside, not the inside. And so my dark night of the soul, if you like, was kind of a dark night of the body. It was a dark night of like realizing that I was not so connected to what I wanted and what I needed. I was connected to what I thought would work, or what I thought, and that's the work of an ethnographic innovation consultant is a fascination with the outside world. What do people want to buy? How do people make choices? And then orientating fully around that to decide what to do. And I think I had that in my own life, where I had to learn that I was allowed to just orientate around what I wanted and what I wanted to be in the world, and that wasn't necessarily the right thing. And even that came to like when I was naming my company, and I had a strong internal sense that it should be called Let's Go. And I started to tell my peers that that was the name of my company. And I think nobody thought it was a good idea. They all thought it sounded too juvenile, not serious, like all of these things. And actually it was one of the moments where I was like, and also it's mine. Like that's going to be, and I had a strong, but that's a return to the body, a return to the ability of a being to choose what they care about, not just to do what fits the market.
Well, I'm hearing that it took you a while, as you'd expect, to get to that relationship with your body.
Yeah.
And that, I suppose, is the function of the dark night, isn't it? Or the lost bit. Because if you're recoding in your work with people and businesses, it must be the case that a lot of the people that you work with and encounter, especially, you do teams in organizations, large organizations, and are living that life themselves, and they're living the life of their power, their energy comes from the frameworks they're working in. It comes from the brand or the business or the title or the role, positional power, all those things. First of all, is that true? Secondly, when you come across that, is that a significant roadblock to doing good work? And if so, how do you work with it?
I think that the really short answer is I don't know. I don't know if that's true. I know that I am not like everyone, or that everyone is not like me. So the particular road that I've gone on, which has required quite a lot of introspection, my fascinations have led me to lots of inward looking, outward looking, to philosophers, to theologians, to spiritual teachers, but I don't see that as like more noble a path than the other paths. I just think it's mine. And so I don't know. I don't orientate myself mostly around the people that I work with as somehow needing what I did or needing what I have. I think good work happens all the time in organizations of all sorts. Yes, I don't know. That's not how I tend to think about it. But the truth is I don't know. So I don't know if other people are, I feel like other people are slightly opaque to me in lots of ways.
When we've been so long in our own worlds, you were both practitioners. I left full-time jobs, employment 25 years ago.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That it's easy to, even while we service and support businesses, it's easy to, you do have to hold a bit of cognitive dissonance or respect, perhaps just acknowledgement that you really don't know how they think and feel, because, you think and feel is the product of the journey you've been on. But I guess what I'm stabbing at is just, if your energy and power and drive and sense of identity came from the organization you belong to, which is, well, we know that's true of many cultures and people, and we're respecting the right of people and the parity. It's an equal path. You work in an organization, you can grow and change and evolve and transform. You don't have to leave and have a dark night of the soul. But how do you, and I think this speaks to what I'm trying to do with my clients, is how do you connect them with their own agency, with their own actual innate sense of individuation and becoming and taking ownership of their own thinking? And perhaps that's not your domain because you're less concerned with the individual and more with the team. But
yeah, I mean, I think what I'm constantly trying to encourage people towards is the question, what do you want to do? And to recognize that they're wanting. So in leadership development, a lot of the requests that I get for leadership development work are sort of framed like, this is the desirable quality or outcome that we want. Can you get people there? And a lot of the way that I would respond to that would be, well, let's equip them to see the situation that they're in and then decide what they want to do with it. So I think I'm more interested in, again, like connecting into those ideas of like each being is going to be a leader that it is. Like it doesn't, there's not one way of being a leader or one kind of orientation. You know, Wittgenstein, sorry to throw in Ludwig Wittgenstein, but his kind of conception of like what language is, or which we could say what thinking is or what life is that it's a series of games that are different. Like each context, we're using words to try and get things done, but the way we're using words will be different in different contexts and different situations. And so in a way, we're playing a game called podcasts, and that has a certain set of rules and there's a certain type of thing that we're doing. And if we were playing the game called walking together in the woods, which we did a few months ago, it would be like we would be talking different, like, you know, like different things are possible in that game. And at work, different things are happening. So I think I always go back to, I'm not in all of the situations that these leaders are in. So it's not my place to decide what's good for them or right for them, because I'm not in their situation and they are. So my job is something more like to remind them that there are different ways they can look at their own situation. And then I don't really see it as a role of a teacher as much as a reminder where like, okay, let's remember together that like these are some of the concerns that we might be having. And then what do you want to do with that? And I think the strength of that approach is that it's really respectful for people's agency. And I think the strength of other approaches, which are more corrective or want to kind of put more content into leaders, like I don't know if my approach shakes people up to the core, and sometimes people need to be shaken up to the core, but that's not the sort of work I tend to do in organizations with leaders. I think that's really good work, and sometimes that's exactly what's needed to get people to break people out of patterns, but I see that's not where I put most of my effort.
The theme of your journey, I suppose, as a person, intellectually and emotionally and applied to work, is from some kind of abstracted way of being to an embodied way. So where thinking is clean and precise and logical in the abstract domain, to a life and a world and a way of giving service that is acknowledging and honoring the messiness and the incompleteness of any thought form and its subjectivity and its contextual nature, all of that. So if I were to characterize the sort of direction of travel in your case, that would be the direction of travel. And if that feels right, the next question would be, how do you work with that practically in helping people? And already I feel, just in listening to our conversation and listening to you and the stories you're telling, that lights will be going off in people's heads who are similar or who are different but relate to bits of it, right? So already for me, there's illumination happening, which is, I suppose, the purpose of this podcast. And it's going to be very personal to the listener. But now maybe it would be helpful for you to ground that shift or that journey into your work. And how do you help people? What are the tools you do? How do you equip them?
Yeah. So I think that's a really nice way of looking at it, and not one that I have. I think but it's true. I feel like I'm interested in thought in as much as it lands in the messy reality of life. And I'm not actually interested in thought for thought's sake. And I'm interested in thinking about thought in as much as it is practical and pragmatic and connects, and therefore is embodied in life and enacted in how we work. So I think that's a really helpful way to think about what I do, which I don't think I have necessarily thought about in those terms before. So with that in mind, I feel like what I am a little bit of a magpie for things or thought or ways of looking that illuminate the messy reality of life, which means that I'm a collector and a crafter of ways of looking. And what that means is that I'm not interested in maps so much, like here is the way to go, the turn left here, turn right here. And I'm really interested in compasses. That is tools, like things that when you look at them, they help you see where things might be. And then you choose which way you go, right? Because you are the guider of your life. But compasses are really good tools. So the Let's Go framework is one of those, but certainly not the only one. And if I look at some of the other things, you know, like someone I absolutely love, a thinker I absolutely love, is called Virginia Satir. And Virginia Satir has these kind of, so she's like the creator of family therapy, really, or like the pioneer of family therapy. There's a lot of psychotherapy going on, and she's the one who says, yeah, it's not so much just about what's going on in your head. It's about how we relate to each other, because to be a human is to relate. And it's not like you're a human being who has relationships. You are a human being through relationships, and you're a relating being. So she has an idea around the kind of stances that we take to each other, that get in the way of good relating, and the stances, and they're basically different ways of being defensive. So we can be blaming, and we know what that looks and feels like. But you can also placate people, which is where you just say what they want to hear, or you can be very dogmatic and see things in one certain kind of way. Anyway, there's a few others, but her framework for thinking about how we relate, or the stances that we have that are defensive and that don't help relationships, like her model for that, I have worked with and worked on. And so the way that I would engage with that is I would be talking to people about those things. We can all notice those things. Oh, when do I sometimes take a blaming stance or a placating stance? Which of those stances do I find difficult? When do I find it difficult? Now let me ground that. So often then I would work with, let's say I'm working with a team, and then I would say, okay, go and spend the next 2 weeks noticing these defensive stances in yourself and others. Because for me, I'm equipping people with ways of looking. And if people can start to notice when they enter blaming as an orientation, and they can acknowledge the unhelpfulness of blaming, like it doesn't help anyone. It's not assertiveness, it's blaming. And then they can shift their blaming into assertiveness, and they can begin to see it in others, but not immediately jump to blame the others for it. And they can see it in themselves and not immediately blame themselves for it. And they can also see how the blaming and the placating and the dogmatic and all these different things are alive in the messy reality of their life. Then those concepts become a kind of compass that people can use to, I'm not even going to say to not be defensive, because I think we're always defensive, humans are defensive, but they can begin to notice defensiveness and see how defensiveness impacts the work that they do. And for me, when you can see the damage that defensiveness does, the damage that happens when people placate each other, the damage that does when people blame each other, you can start to make shifts that are not shifts from an instruction, like a map, like here's how to stop being defensive, but like a compass, like, okay, now I can orientate differently, and I can understand when my own defensiveness is getting in the way of a good working relationship or something like that. So I don't know if that's maybe more of an example than exact. So I'm often asking people to, here's a simple idea that is not a clever idea that you need to learn. It's just something you already know. Now go and notice that in the real world, and then reflect on what you noticed. And I feel like that process of noticing and reflecting and noticing and reflecting is the process of seeing in a new way, because we're always seeing in one way or another. And I think what I'm asking people to do, and I'm asking myself to do often, is how could we see, how could we use, so I think ideas are lenses more than they are abstractions when they're at their best. They're lenses because you can see through them differently. You see different things when you look through this lens and when you look through that lens. And so I find myself like a lens hunter, like what are good lenses? And then letting people try out those lenses, seeing what they see through those lenses. And that helps me see whether they're just good lenses for me or good lenses for a wider set of people. And I don't think those lenses are ever true or right or the only way to look, but it's like, what do you see when you look in this way? What do you see when you look in that way? And so playing with different ways of looking, I see as one of the, let's call it like the meta skills that I'm working with in my work. And I feel like a lot of the ways of looking that we have are stagnant and muddy and scratched. So we're trying to look at the world, but our lenses are all messed up. So I'm sort of some kind of optician of how we work together.
Or optician of how we look at reality in order to work together.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, maybe. And maybe the part that I'm not there yet with, and the part that I see something, I'm using lenses to look at certain kinds of things. And mostly the thing is work. That's what I'm using it. And of course, I'm interested in not just work. And I have obsessed about work for so long that I am pretty good at looking at how we think about work. But I also think there are things to do beyond work. There are things to do like society. There are things to do like, our relationships, our parenting, these things. And these are things that I think I'm probably less good at looking at. I'm less well practiced on what are the exact right lenses for looking at these broader or more personal issues. And so maybe one of the development areas for me is to expand my set of lenses from only focusing on work to focusing on the things that really matter that aren't just work.
Because your call to action or your headline and your website is, you help us to think about living in a complex world or something like this.
Yeah.
It is broader already, isn't it? And your interest isn't just effective leadership. It's how do we live in complexity. I love the idea of the lens metaphor. I also would like to hear more about the scratchy, foggy lenses, because that's exactly what I sense in myself and in the world at large is the lenses that we use. Perhaps we have a few different pairs of glasses and contacts that we take on and off, but they don't seem to be they don't seem to be quite the right bifocal like strength, or I'm going to stretch the metaphor.
So I definitely think this. So maybe I'll just say this, one of the frustrations that I have with, let's say, like leadership discourse is people say, because I have a model, right? The Let's Go model is a model, and it's a set of lenses that you can look through. And sometimes the first response that I get is like, oh, we don't need another model. We already have lots of models. So I'm working with a high street bank in the UK, and I'm doing executive education for their top 350. And there was a little bit of a sense of like, you know what, we've got a lot of models. I don't know if we need another model, was kind of like the first contact with them. They were like, we really like what you do. We really like the ideas here, but we're not sure we need another model. And so there's two things that happened. One is I sort of changed the language around what I was doing, which is like I stopped talking about model and I started talking about 5 powerful questions you can ask. And there was a frustration in me, which is like that idea of whether we have enough or don't have enough models completely ignores the fact that like some of those models are not working for us, and actually getting good at throwing away old models that no longer work for us is a good thing. So for example, I think, we have models of what a good team looks like that are out of date, because what a team is different from what it was 20 years ago. We used to operate in very strict divisions, and our teams were like the unit in which work happened. And increasingly, what's happening is work is happening in cross-functional groups. It's happening in project streams. It's happening between the organization and its partners in the outside world or other partners internally. So it's more messy. And therefore, our framework of team is sort of, we're using it like team building, as if there's a type of thing called team building, as if a team is a type of thing that has a firm structure and that it stays the same over time. And that there's a type of thing called a team leader, and that team leader runs a team, and the team look up to the team leader for guidance or whatever. And that isn't really how most teams operate now. So I would say that's an example of a bad lens that we have. Our model of team, and even is like, it contains some ideas that we don't even realize that are there, but it presupposes a team is a static, ongoing entity that needs to become high performing. And it doesn't even acknowledge that often teams are actually collections of people doing different things. And sometimes those things are in a team and sometimes aren't. So a question I would ask of a team is, what are you a team for and what are you a team not for? Because sometimes you're not a team. And the times you're not a team is interesting, because then you don't need to be a team in those times. You're not a team. Those are times when there's just a clear division of labor and you just get on with it, or you're working cross-functionally with other groups. So I think this is an example of how, again, really practically, not very sophisticated, but how our ideas are out of date, or our lenses no longer fit our prescription of our eyes. And so the idea of whether we have enough models or not enough models is like an annoying one to me, because I feel like, well, we haven't even considered what we're actually looking at. And if we know what we need to look at, then we might need to throw some old models away and pick up some new ones.
For some reason, I want to ask you if you can bring us back to Wittgenstein.
Okay.
Because the idea of language and living in a city of language.
Okay, yeah.
Because I watch your YouTube channel, and what you learned from him, and of course, anyone else, of course, you want to bring in. But I'd like, if you can, link that to the idea of lenses.
Yeah.
That'd be nice.
So Wittgenstein says language is a city, an ancient city. And what he means is there are some old bits, right? Some of those old bits have been renovated in ways, and there's also new neighborhoods that get built alongside old neighborhoods, and some of the streets are like very peculiar and particular. And what he's sort of saying is we need to let go of the idea that words always mean something in one context, or that the way we talk is always the same in one context. And this image of language as a city is two things. One is it's saying there are different regions of the city. So again, the region of business executive education is very different from the region of, operational efficiency in the real world of whatever, different kinds of companies. So there's these different regions and they operate differently because they've been built differently. And our job isn't to understand language or understand what the right speech is, but our business is just getting around the city. Can we get around the bits that we care about and that we're interested in? And so I think this idea of language, and again, language as a city means that language is not a thing you use, it's a place you live. You can't ever escape it. You're in it. You're in language. We're in language. We're using language to try and talk about language, but ultimately, we are also subject to language, which makes these kinds of conversations can be really exciting and illuminating. And for some people might listen and go, I don't even know where they're going with this, because you're in the thing itself, trying to talk about the thing. So the conversation we're having now, where we're using language to talk about language, can be, for some of us who think that way and who are interested in that way, can feel very enlivening and like exciting. And for others, maybe listening and thinking, I don't even know why they're going around in circles. It seems very abstract. It seems like, what does this mean? And I think that's just because it might not be a region of language or a region of the city that they're particularly interested in or motivated by, which would be fine. Like, people don't need to all be interested in the things that we're interested in, and the world needs people who have peculiarities and particularities and fascinations. And this podcast hopefully is for folks who are like fascinated by these kinds of conversations, but there's plenty of people who won't be, and that's fine too. And I certainly wouldn't talk like this in my leadership development work, because it would be, again, like you just get glazed eyes and confused expressions. But I guess these kind of things informs how I think about leadership. And I mean, for me, leadership and language aren't so far apart. All that leaders do is talk, and all that they do is have conversations. And so for me, this is a useful way to think about that. So Wittgenstein's idea of us living inside language, it being a place we live, and it being a place with different parts that operate by different conventions. And there's no way to understand a city, because a city just is what it is, and it's been built the way it's been built. So you need to find your way around more than you need to understand it in some sort of abstract sense.
But there's a part of the city, isn't there? Or is there a part of the city where architects and engineers are hanging out and they're talking about buildings, like language buildings, and then they're figuring out and they're innovating a little bit, or they're coming up with new ideas, and then they're going out and prototyping them, and then ultimately you talk about that in your leadership executive trainings, but you talk about it in a different way, using a different part of the city.
100%. Right? As well as being an optician's, where you're looking and you're saying, hey, try these lenses on, what do you see? Which is sort of what I do in my leadership work. There needs to be some work that happens in that opticians to design and figure out the technical specifications of new lenses, right? What would be appropriate lenses? What are the types of lenses that might be appropriate for different situations? That work, that craftsmanship needs to exist in order that you can walk into a leadership development context and go, here are 3 simple ways to look at the world.
And that's a fundamentally collaborative kind of innovation, isn't it? You can't do that on your own entirely.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And I suppose part of what we're doing, this is part of that. This is just one corner of that, isn't it? Talking about ideas is one corner of how ideas get formed and language gets formed.
And I would say often my collaborators, which is like, I've talked about a few of them, Virginia Satir, Martin Heidegger, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Rob Babeya. We could have talked about Donna Haraway, Alva Noy, James Hillman, Jim McNeish, who's a mentor of mine who's really influenced me, but goes back to Werner Erhard and the whole of the potential movement, Alfred North Whitehead, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, like these kind of thinkers for me. And I think often what I'm looking for is these kind of thinkers who think more fundamentally. I'm much less interested in leadership development thinkers than I am in people who are really contend with the human condition. Because for me, when you go back there, you've got like baseline material that is useful, separate from a specific context. Whereas like a business school is often full of things that in a way fit one particular strand of the world, which then gets out of date quite quick. So I think a lot of business books get out of date quite quick because they're really contending with the immediate context. And I'm more interested in the human condition, the characteristics of an eye, then how do we design lenses for an eye, more than, oh, people want to look at this particular thing. How do we set that up? And I think that's where, if my work has a depth to it, the depth is opposed to an immediate, some people orientate around, I don't know, what the market wants to buy, like who's buying what in leadership development, what's the trends. I'm very uninterested in that. Like, I want to lean on thinkers whose work goes beyond a particular moment in time. So like Virginia Satir will never not be interesting on how humans relate. For me, she is like an absolute pillar. You can rest your whole weight on her because she's got a strength and a solidity in her in how she sees the world, and a depth of practice that isn't just only relevant in this situation or that situation. It's just relevant to humans. And there's others who are really good at thinking about particular situations, and I tend not to lean so heavily on them, even if they're interesting. Like an example would be radical candor with Kim Scott, a very popular idea. But for me, like a popular idea that's quite narrow, it sort of says that we should always speak the truth as exactly how we see it, and we should do that kindly. It's kind of a call to intensity, to more intense speech. And I think that's relevant sometimes, really helpful sometimes. I've seen it really transformational in organizations. And for me, it's not relevant all the time. There's times when indirect speech is more powerful than direct speech.
What do you feel is important for us to talk about? There are a couple of things in my mind. I would like to know, as I can feel your intensity, right? When you start to talk about, when I ask you about practical applications and we get into lenses and it's wow, this full power intensity, right? And passion.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about how much space you've managed to create around that for yourself as well in your life, and nervous system, related as well. How much are you able to drop in and out? I would like to hear a bit about how Donna Haraway plays in your thinking, because I'd read a bit of her book and I feel that that's interesting and it's an influence as well. But I'd be fascinated to hear how you apply that or bring that to bear in businesses.
Yeah.
I think those are the two things that I'd love to cover. Is there anything that you feel is important to feel like we've rounded things into some place?
That feels great. I don't have a strong internal sense, I don't think. I mean, I could intensely talk about lots of other thinkers, but I like the point where you say, the intensity is there. And the thing is, sometimes that word has followed me around a lot, intensity. And I have to just live with that, I think. I think I used to quite intensely think, how do I be less intense? And now I don't think about that so much. I'm just like, this is sort of how I'm shaped in the world.
How has parenthood and parenting shaped that?
Yeah, I think your point about how, I'm going to go to your first question first, and then I'll maybe touch on parenting. I think, like, how do I create the space for the softness and the depth? I think I've often found that in, like, if I just reflect personally, which is nothing to do with my practice, is like, I found that in kind of personal development settings where there's like a clear container, where I can, I feel very easy to sort of within a particular constraint or within a particular, let's say, a group setting, to be like, okay, like, how do we, take it in turns to share something of where we're coming from? That really does a good job for me, because it opens up warmth and a softness that is really helpful. But I think, it's one of the things I probably still contend with, like, the passion arrives, but also sometimes can be overwhelming for me and others. I would certainly connect to a sort of ADHD hyper-focus sort of idea that's in culture. I've a complex relationship with the idea of diagnosis and whether that's something that I'm interested in, and even the grouping and whether it's too broad and what that means. But that's the type of intensity, even to think that about ADHD. So I clearly have some of that, and it goes in waves. Like, I can be, in this conversation, I can be very full, and then in other conversations, I less so. So in terms of parenthood, I think it's been a real challenge for me to kind of find patterns that are different. I think, domestic life would probably be a realm of life where I don't feel like an overachiever, but I have a beautiful daughter, a wonderful partner, and feel very blessed. But the blessing is kind of like it's sometimes, I have to slow down and I have to calm down, and that is good for me, but not always comfortable for me. So I think I'll say that.
Yeah. Thank you. In your YouTube stuff, which is spaced over a few years now, I pick up quite a lot of that softness and gentleness in your nature, if I can say such a thing. And I wonder if teaching brings it out of you a little bit as well.
Yeah.
Because as you're a teacher, as you're a thinker and you're a consultant, but there's definitely a sort of teacher vibe as part of it.
Yeah, definitely. I think if I look at the Let's Go journey, it's been one of moving from, like, let's call it impassioned description of like this particular approach to holding space for people to explore. And I clearly see the advantage of that. I think I'm like, my business partner, Phil, has got more power in that realm of like the holding space, the spaciousness, the warmth. And I learn from working with him and also with others. I'm always going to be, I think, a little towards the impassioned kind of, I get really enthused by things like, what did we talk about? Intoxicated. I think that's a big theme of my life, becoming intoxicated with something. I think that can be really inspiring and also sometimes a bit overwhelming for people. So I'm aware of that balancing act.
Yeah. In the work of Donna Haraway
Yeah.
that I've touched on, which is just the meager, the very beginning, so there, she's seems to be evangelizing for this kind of softness, actually, and spaciousness and living in the muck. I would like to ambitiously join this question, the personal question that I asked you, to a question about the world and about, well, where you sit on the, or where you move back and forth on the spectrum of optimism and hope versus pessimism or realism, and maybe with reference to Donna Haraway in some sense, as how are we doing?
Okay, so maybe this is where I jump to. Let me explain a few concepts. So Donna Haraway famously wrote a book or a pamphlet or an essay in the 80s called Cyborg Manifesto, which basically said that we have these distinctions between natural and artificial, between human and non-human. And these distinctions that we have actually don't work in practice because we have telephone lines, we have power systems. To be a human, and these are all entangled with what it means to be a human. And so to be a human is already a cyborg reality. We are already entangled with technology. So technology isn't other than us. It's not like a thing we have. It's who we are. Our being extends through technology. And she's writing this before we have smartphones and AI and all this sort of stuff, right? And so I think this kind of cyborg entangled nature, to be a human is, what is unnatural. Even like if you look at the cities we build them from natural things. So are they that different from anthills? Like, I don't know really. Like, okay, that's the cyborg thing. And then the latest book that she's written that I've read is called Staying with the Trouble. And this is her idea of us. She's sort of contending with living and dying well on a damaged planet, which is how do we recognize that the world, the environmental systems or the ecosystems that we live in are often don't really work. Extinctions are happening at a really rapid rate. And so staying with the trouble is a kind of call to say, how do we neither hide in a kind of pessimism like everything's broken and everything's falling apart and therefore we're bad, or in a kind of naive optimism like everything's going to be fine if only we do more carbon capture. And so her call is a call to staying with the trouble, staying with the troubled boundaries, these boundaries, human, non-human, the boundaries between those, and recognizing that the boundaries aren't as clear as we thought. And so what I found very enlivening about her book is I think it's a call to pay attention, to include the difficulties of the lives without trying to clean everything up. So a call to live in this messy reality and to contend with what it means to live and die well in that context, and to borrow from and to not feel like you need to be right or not to feel like you ever can be right, but to be constantly updating your ideas. So to realize that you need to sometimes be called out for inconsistencies, but that you can do that. I guess hers is staying with the trouble acknowledges that no one's ever going to be perfect, and therefore kind of it can't be about purity tests for each other. It has to be about, but it also has to be not a hiding from the difficult, blurry, messy boundaries we live in. And so like one of her examples is she's really sort of says that I'm broadly persuaded by the call to veganism and I still eat meat, and I try and stay with the trouble of the choice that I've made there. And I try and make choices within the messy choice that I'm making for me and for the critters and for the environment that I live in, which doesn't try and pretend that therefore my position is right and their position is wrong, but that stays with the trouble of like, that also includes like the massive industrial scale soybean production that causes as much trouble as other kinds of farming practices. Recognizing that while she might be able to choose organic grass-fed meat, that she's doing that in a social system, that there's lots of other people who aren't in positions where they can choose those things. So again, avoiding purity and staying with the trouble of a damaged world. And that's Donna Haraway, and I'm very compelled by her picture of that. And I feel like I try to stay with the trouble. I try to not clean myself up or excuse myself. I live in a world where I am fairly well paid to work with business leaders. That affords me certain kinds of possibilities that just aren't there available for other people. So I try and avoid a kind of righteousness from that, and also stay with the trouble of the fact that the world is difficult and complex. And
does staying with the trouble spit out some kind of virtue, some kind of value that is beyond the human, obviously very necessary capacity to stay with the trouble? I've got 3 children, you've got 1 child, we each have our own things to contend with. There's a lot of trouble to stay with, and you learn how to stay with the trouble. Ultimately, though, you don't want to be swimming in muck and confusion just in order to be swimming in muck and confusion. If you're holding a model of some kind of good in the world,
yeah,
or the creation of good, then you're hoping that from that there'll be a product of that. Is that true?
Yeah. I think I'm trying to find Donna Haraway's words for it, but I think her whole point is like, how do we live and die well, given that this is the trouble? So how do we live and die well in a damaged planet and in a damaged
practically
world? Yeah, like what do we do? What's the next right thing to do given that? How do we build community? And for her, it's like, how do we recognize? She's sort of asking us to move beyond a human-centric view of the world and include what she wants is human. She takes it 2 different directions. One is like us, the particular kind of creature that we are, but human also connects to humus, which is like compost or earthly. And she says we are all compost, but not just humans are compost, like other critters are compost as well. And so she talks about the Thulacine, but it sort of means the time at which the earthly ones need to contend with the world. And the earthly ones aren't just humans. So how do humans and non-humans live in relations and acknowledge that they're all part of this system that we're in? So her call is beyond just how do we get humans working well in this world, and how do we get the world and all of the earthly ones living and dying well, which doesn't mean that no one's going to die, and doesn't mean that I won't, occasionally eat a cow, but it just means there's a way of living and dying well for that cow and for me in relation to that cow that are different from, that we could probably point to things like factory farming and say, that ain't good. That is not living and dying well.
Nice. And we don't need to do it here. I can just imagine how you would extrapolate this without even talking about it to businesses and organizations and teams, because you're holding the lens of living with the trouble, being with the trouble, staying with the trouble. And I'm guessing that's pretty valuable.
And that's something I haven't really done. Like, I haven't really taken that into the world of work, and I haven't really contended with that. And I've, sometimes found in Donna Haraway, I found a lens that, I look for lenses. I think the kind of moral lens that says, okay, the world is a certain way, therefore we need certain kinds of actions, for me feels like, I don't know how useful that feels for a lot of the conversations I'm in, because there's so much baked into what one should do. But the staying with the trouble lens, I can really imagine that living really well. I can imagine that clearing up things for leaders who have to contend with their own staying with the trouble. So yeah, I haven't taken that into the world of work, but I can really imagine it, as you say.
That's fun to watch, yeah. So just to land this plane, wherever it's landing, it would be nice to hear, well, you didn't quite answer whether or how optimistic you feel. And it might be an irrelevant linguistic part of the city of language. But yeah, I'd be interested in your answer to that. It'd be nice for you to leave us one book that you might suggest that our listeners could listen to, could enjoy, read. And then I think one practice might be interesting too. So a book, a practice, the optimism question, anything else you want to say?
Again, the optimism question I avoided because I don't know. I don't know how optimistic I am. I don't feel pessimistic. I don't feel optimistic. I feel quite wait and see. Like I feel like some questions are way beyond my capacity to know. And that feels one of them. Like, where's the world going? I don't know. I've actually let myself not know. And I feel sometimes I feel like I'm just letting myself off the hook. And sometimes I feel like, no, it's appropriate. I am in no place to know. I'm not informed enough. I don't have the perspective to know. So that's deliberately avoided.
But you must feel hopeful enough to do your work about organizations at the very least, and about people you work with.
There's a song in Frozen 2 that says something like, do the next right thing. And I feel like that's sort of what I try, and my focus point is actually not long in the future. It's quite short term. And I think sometimes that's a blindness. Sometimes that's the particular lens I've chosen. Sometimes that's wise. And I'm not attached to any of those. I think sometimes I'm avoiding bigger questions by just looking at the immediate. I feel optimistic that we can make good choices, and that choices, but I don't have a clear sense of how that plays out in the long term. I think that there's some things, some questions which I feel like we're headed for some difficult realities, and I don't know what the answer to that is.
Give us a practice for doing the next right thing, or the next whatever it is. Give us a practice, or a practice for looking at the world differently or more clearly. Something that is lens related, and something you do daily or often.
Yeah, I'm a bit stumped. I think the practice is dialogue. The practice is have the conversation. So a quote that I use a lot by Werner Erhard is, a problem only exists in the absence of the right conversation. And I feel like more is created in, like, this conversation, I was like, I didn't know where it was going to go. And, whatever others get from it, I've got something from it. Like, I've got something from the mirror, the way it works, and from our other conversations, where they have a slightly different feeling as well because of the context for them. So I think conversations and dialogue, David Bohm writes about this, lots of other people, but even just the kind of conversations that go somewhere that you couldn't have gone on your own, I think is really powerful. And I feel like that is probably more my practice than, I sort of wanted to say something like meditation, but the truth is I don't meditate that often. I try, and I don't know if that's, maybe the other practice would be like exercise. Like, I feel like being in your body and connected to your body is a really good way of knowing what the next right thing to do is, because you're more grounded and rooted. Like, mowing the lawn or cutting a hedge will get you clearer about your life than lots of thinking, because we are embodied beings. So body connection.
And if I'm allowed to ask, and you're allowed to view a book as embodied enough, and perhaps physical book,
the one that I read last is Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble. She is a wicked poet with language. She plays with language in a way that can feel quite befuddling, like I found reading her, but also I enjoyed it, and I kind of absorbed from her a lot. I actually found a podcast with her a little more accessible, and then that gave me a bit more ground to find the Staying with the Trouble book. I enjoy where it goes, and I have found it really powerful. I think, I could name philosophy books, but the truth is I'm often accompanied through philosophy books. So I often listen to a lot of podcasts about as well. And I would like my Martin Heidegger video comes from listening to 25 hours of a Hubert Dreyfus lecture on Heidegger. Right. So it's rarely just from a book itself, certainly a philosophy books. I'm mostly accompanied through them in dialogue. So therefore takes me back to my practice, which is dialogue, talking, exploring.
And what one good tip for good dialogue? I know we're over time, but just to
try and be honest about how you feel rather than how you think you should feel. Try and not clean up everything to be impressive or to sound right, but just to say what comes up for you. A practice for that I found really useful is where you're in any kind of group or circle which just involves listening to people, and just listening to more people. Everyone has the same question and answers on it, and you don't try and turn everything into a conversation. You just hear people out.
Thank you. Rich, thank you very much for taking the time. I've really enjoyed it, and it's been intense, but I've liked that.
Story of my life, Lawrence. Story of my life. Thank you for sort of initiating the conversation, and I've really enjoyed it, and look forward to our next walk in the woods.